in the school environment, there's a lack of respect. That's something that's very different within Gamechangers. Like Heather and Ayden have a lot of experience in this field, but they're not using that to belittle the youth, but rather like uplift our ideas.
Sometimes the most powerful anti-violence work is felt before it's seen. That's something the Gamechangers reminded me of when I sat down with them for the third installment of our youth engagement mini-series. Who are the Gamechangers? I guess I have two answers to that. The Gamechangers are a youth leadership team out of Wisconsin. A group of diverse high school students across the Madison area, like Azalea and Crystal, who you'll meet in this podcast episode, who are mobilizing their schools and communities to end gender and power-based violence. The Gamechangers are also Heather and Ayden, two staff in the Prevention Education Department at RCC, working behind the scenes to create transformative spaces that honor youth voices. I sat down with all of them to hear about their program and what makes their youth engagement so impactful, whether that's in their organizations, in spaces they work with youth, or in the community. I think what made this conversation so powerful to me, and probably what makes Gamechangers special in its own right, is that, they gave me all the tools and the tips to invest in youth engagement just like I asked them. But hearing them share together, what resonated even more than that is that you can feel the space they're creating. You feel it each time Heather and Ayden throw some hype and appreciation toward each other. Each time Heather says Queenie, and you feel it when Crystal and Azalea talk about what it feels like to be in Gamechangers. Gamechangers is the kind of space that can't exist without investment at every level of an organization. Adults choosing to put their time, effort, and dollars into something because they believe in it. It's the kind of space that was built slowly, brick by brick, that changed over time, and that's okay. It's the kind of space that is authentic, that's daring, and that makes a difference. As RCC celebrates its 50th anniversary this year, we're talking about what it took to make Gamechangers what it is today. I always love our podcasts and the deep passion our guests bring into the movement to end sexual violence. But I'm going to be honest, this one felt extra special to me. Azalea, Crystal, Ayden, and Heather are bringing their full selves, their honesty, and so much experience to this conversation. If you enjoyed it half as much as I did, I know you'll love it. Thank you all so much for being here with me on this podcast. I feel like we've been talking about doing this for feels like months. It's probably been weeks, but everything feels longer for me these days.
Thank you for being patient with us.
No, are you kidding me? Also, for so many people to be on the podcast, I think this is my biggest podcast recording. So welcome, everyone. How are you?
Good. Thank
We're
you so
good.
much.
How are you, Queens?
So good.
Good.
We're very excited to be here with you today.
I'm so glad. I'm excited to have you. Can you start just with a quick introduction of who you are and what you do at RCC?
Absolutely. I can go first. My name is Heather. I am the prevention coordinator at the RCC Sexual Violence Center in Madison, Wisconsin. I've been with the agency for 6 years, and I specifically specialize in kind of youth prevention. So largely high school students like these brilliant ones who are on this call with us. So I'm going to pass it over to the Queens himself. Who wants to go first?
I guess I can go first. I'm Azalea. I've been working here, I've been doing the volunteer work for, I think, 3 years now. This is my third year. And I'm just on the youth advisory board, so I get to work with people like Heather and Ayden. And we do these really fun projects just to help, like, our community. And I really like it. It's really fun.
Yeah, my name is Crystal. I'm also part of the Gamechangers Youth Advisory Board at RCC. So I also get to work with Heather, Ayden, and Azalea. Like Azalea said, I work with a group of individuals, and we do a lot of community work, and it's honestly just a really fun environment to be a part of.
Amazing. My name is Ayden Prihera. I'm the Assistant Director of Education at the RCC Sexual Violence Resource Center. I've been with the agency for just over 18 months, coming into my second year with the organization. And I get to spend most of my days with middle school and high school students in schools, as well as with the Gamechangers from time to time.
Awesome. Thank you. And I heard, we were just chatting before we hit record, you all went to the same high school. Is that right?
We absolutely
correct. Did. At very different times. I shan't be disclosing my graduation year. Just kidding.
I love that. We've got multi-generational and like keeping it in the community. That sounds awesome. So I have to say, I'm especially excited for this interview because you all are the first guests that I connected with organically. I knew nothing about you all, and I only heard about RCC through the youth program because I follow RCC Gamechangers on Instagram, and I'm a big fan of your account. So I feel like I'm meeting my work crushes right now. So I'm really excited to have you here. Can you tell me a little bit about your youth engagement work?
Go for it, Queens. You got this.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is our most recent project because Heather and Ayden are helping Crystal and I and a couple other people put together an art show involving local artists around Madison. And so I think that's really exciting, and that's kind of showcasing how exciting the work is because it's so involved. And we're doing this art show. I think Crystal helped to come up with a name for it. It's the art of intersectionality. And so it's just been so cool because we've been getting to talk to really interesting people like you, Janae, and other artists to communicate with them and put together something really beautiful for the community. And I think that kind of summarizes just for the most part what Crystal and I end up doing on the youth advisory board for that program. Because I think it's just a lot of interacting with people around the community.
Yeah, I also think it's super cool that we participate in a very wide range of projects. Azalea and I are doing the art show, but there's another group that's planning a rally. And last year, or previous years, we've done a project or volunteer sort of presentation before. And just a big variety of projects. Also, a big part of Gamechangers is the material that we get to learn. Like Azalea said, we get to meet a lot of people, but not only are we putting that back out into the community, we're also getting to intake a lot of information.
So our youth work looks like a few different things, but absolutely connected to what these amazing students have already said. So the Gamechangers program is made up of students from across Dane County. I would say kind of 20 to 25 is the number that we're working with now. And students apply for this program and are paid for it, which is a really important part of accessibility and making sure that we have a diverse team of students in all different ways. It also is important because we have students from kind of different kinds of schools. Every school has different needs depending on where it is, and having all of those kind of knowledge bases come together collectively is really powerful. So as students mentioned, we hear from community leaders. I want students to be able to hear about jobs in social services, in nonprofit, in advocating for others. We give them some of those skills, and I ask students things that they're interested in learning about that I think are important in doing our work. Part of the basis of our youth work is our work will be intersectional. It will be intersectional or it will be nothing. In this program, we really focus on the fact that all survivors currently are not being served in the way that they should be. So we need to start talking about things like racism and transphobia and classism in order to really meet survivors where they are. We do kind of this work by hearing from guest speakers, by doing presentations that students have let me know that they're interested in. And then students kind of take that knowledge, take some of the facilitation skills that we learn about, take some of the kind of long-term planning skills that we teach about, and do these long-term projects for us. So I would say they're kind of community impact projects. Sometimes the agency will ask students to do a certain project because in the past they've really knocked it out of the park. for all the projects and events that they've planned. And then, but most of the time it's students seeing a need in the community, communicating it with the group, kind of coming to some collective ideas about who audiences are that we want to reach this year, what are kind of some of the messages or needs we're seeing, and then deciding how to achieve that. So that looks like long-term planning. It can look like anything like in the very beginning when I was in this position, like students reported a podcast. As Crystal mentioned, last year we had a workshop where around 50 kind of school administrators, other youth, folks that work with youth came and learned about how to best support student survivors. And again, that was because so many students were saying like, we are not seeing great stuff from school leadership. So our youth work is intersectional. It is youth-led. And I would also say our youth work helps guide our agency. These students let us know, here's patterns that we're seeing. Here's ways that would be more effective to communicate with youth. And that helps us do all of our work. And I know that Ayden also uses things that because Ayden's also worked with Gamechangers, things that he's picked up to kind of inform his work. You may want to talk about that a little.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my role, I'm largely doing kind of some of that like earlier prevention work in schools. So mostly going to middle schools and high schools across the county, really starting those conversations about consent, talking about boundary setting, talking about healthy relationships and how we can be more accountable to each other, and just create spaces where we can all, show up as our best selves, and really work towards that goal of, being free from sexual violence, right? The Gamechangers have been the single most important part of developing this curriculum. I've been working with Linnea Helm, who's a wonderful graduate student at UW, and we've brought in the Gamechangers at really critical pieces of this project of developing and standardizing our curriculum. Our Gamechangers helped us, sit down and go over evaluation protocol and like what is going to make the most sense for young people when you get that half sheet, that dreaded half sheet in front of you. What is going to make you want to fill it out? How is that going to feed back to the information that we can use and then be able to, set that plan to have that continued conversation, touch back in with students? What makes you want to continue to engage with an organization that kind of has a scary name and you might not naturally want to go engage all of the time, but still know it's important work. We've also been able to pilot this curriculum that we've spent, 18 months developing with the Gamechangers and get that really raw in the moment feedback of, Ayden, that was good, but this needs work. Or this really landed for me, but the way that you talked about age of consent, for instance, needs some workshopping. Make it feel more accessible, make it feel a little bit less scary and more like we can apply it in our understanding of our own lives. And that has been the single most important part of this project. Like anything that Lena and I did, just kind of like tippy tapping away at our computers, like that can just be blown away by the input that we got from these incredible young leaders.
You're listening to Prevent Connect, the podcast bringing together voices from across the movement to end gender and power-based violence, to give you the tools to practice primary prevention in your daily life and at work. We're highlighting emerging research, promising strategies, and stories from on-the-ground prevention practitioners doing this work in new and innovative ways. Bringing you topics like foundational strategies to prevent violence, primary prevention and youth engagement, critical race theory and school climates, prevention in a digital age, and more. I'm your host, Janae Sargent, and this is Prevent Connect. Thank you so much. And yeah, there's so much about what all of you said that I want to dive into. And I know that we're going to get there. I'm hearing first and foremost, youth leadership. And that's the whole reason why I wanted to do this podcast series. We get asked all the time from people who do prevention. How do I work with youth? How do I engage youth? How do I bring youth to our programs? But true transformative youth leadership has the potential to guide agencies in a different direction, as it should. Because if we're doing prevention, we need to be centering the voices of those who are most impacted. That's youth. You are the experts on your experiences. And what I sometimes find is that agencies want to engage youth, but are not prepared for that change. So when that happens, or when youth say something that doesn't jive with what an agency is already doing, then some unintentional harm can be done. And I'm hearing that not only do you, Ayden and Heather, allow for Azalea, Crystal, and everyone else in the Gamechangers to take the lead, but you embrace it. And I'm curious about how you got there. How did your youth engagement work evolve over time? And what have you learned as you've done this work?
So I started in this position and took over this program mid-year. So, halfway through this, I think Gamechangers, at least what it's turned into, is a lot of trust building. We talk about self-care. We talk about longevity and advocacy and activism. So it was wild to come in halfway through the year. So what the program looked very different when I started. I will say it was, this program was born from a grant, which I'm really grateful for. When presidential administrations changed, so did that grant, and that money went away. So with that comes the challenge of finding funding, but also more freedom to not exactly follow these very rigid grant requirements, because, as you so aptly put it, sometimes adults don't know exactly what is going to make a youth program successful, and what is actually going to engage you so they participate. So at the beginning, it was very focused on just sexual assault and really kind of nitty-gritty policy work, which I think is really important. But I do think it really lacked an intersectional approach. And I also think it lacked, like you said, more youth-led attitudes, asking students, being entirely flexible. If a quarter of the way through the year we decide, okay, this is an issue we need to address, we'll spend a lot of time talking about certain things. So I think at the beginning it was much more kind of like sterile and rigid. That's kind of the way that I would put it. And over time, I learned, working with youth, they have all the answers. They are, including these two brilliant queens on this call, are so much smarter than many of the folks that, let's say, I worked at the state and in other capacities. So they had the answers. They are the experts of their own lived experiences. They know what's happening in schools in a way that's very different. They're engaged and know how to more effectively communicate with their peers. I saw that when we also kind of really started doing work that involves all survivors, meaning talking about, again, topics like race and sexuality and gender and class, that students were more engaged, because I think this generation of students is really interested in empowering marginalized voices. That's been at least my experience. So, oh my God, Heather, we'll stop talking. But that's kind of what youth work should look like to me, because when it's a little bit more confined, there's no room for that natural creative direction, and also for students to say, this is what we need and this is what we're going to do. I don't know, Ayden, do you identify with that at all? I know that you've come in more recently.
Yeah, definitely. I think that coming into the RCC, I've seen youth work happen in a way that I wish it worked when I was a young person doing youth work. I feel like when, 10, 12 years ago, when I was doing this, there was such a overburdening without the kind of output of that work, right? Like, young folks would be asked to do so much. And then once that project was done, adults were like, actually, this is, too radical. This isn't what we wanted. This isn't what we expected. So we're not going to accept it. And that was always something that I had a lot of tension with, right? And I've tried to, coming into adulthood, knowing that I want to continue doing youth work on the other side, right, is make sure that that is never part of how I show up to young folks. So for me, watching this Gamechangers group really tell us how it is, how it's going to work, and then being able to say, oh my God, we don't have to develop a program. We don't have to spend, 18 months, 2 years putting together something that like people are going to show up in a room and not want to listen to. That's a waste of resources. That's a waste of time, and is, belittling to the young folks who you are sharing space with in the classrooms, right? We could do it the right way. We could bring youth into it. We could make sure that what we are actually bringing into our community is going to work, right? It's going to be something that folks want to talk about. Otherwise, it's truly just kind of wasting everyone's time. And that's the last thing that we want to do. These are hard conversations that we're often having. And if you don't frame it the right way, it's going to turn a lot of people away from these conversations, maybe for the rest of their lives.
I also just made a brief connection. Ayden, going along with the fact we all went to the same high school at, again, very different times. Ayden and I both did youth work when we were youth. So I'm realizing that was also probably important for us, again, having that same feeling of like adults ask us what we need, ask us to lay out a plan, an action plan. And then once we give that to them, they're like, no, actually, we're not going to do that because it's too radical or because it's a different approach. So I think it's also interesting that I think maybe also that's another reason we're good at this. We've come from there and seen, again, that harm that you talked about done.
Crystal, Azalea, I would love to hear from you both. How did you get to be involved in RCC? And what has your experience been like? Have you seen some of those things like what Ayden and Heather were talking about come through in the work that you're doing with Gamechangers?
I think, yeah, it definitely has, because as Heather was mentioning, how she disliked how in some situations with like youth work, there's a lot of structure and it's a little bit less fluid. Something that I really like about the program that Ayden and Heather and everyone else has thrown together for us is that there's definitely structure and there's definitely like a procedure for what we do for every single in-person meeting we have. There's always educational material that we're interacting with, and it's always being updated too, like Heather mentioned. If someone expresses that they have something that they're fascinated with or they want to know more about, Heather or Ayden or a different person always finds materials for us, and they always make sure that we have resources. And they're always there too to kind of let us do our own thing with the projects, and then they're always there if we need a helping hand with anything. And I think because they've been doing work for so much longer than we have, they're really able to offer us additional advice and perspectives that we may not have thought of. And I think it really helps because then we have this multifaceted perspective for our work because we have them helping us, and then we get to kind of have our own expression too.
I think a big part of the difference between like the environment in Gamechangers versus my experience with like community service in schools and clubs and things like that is that we get respect from adults, which sounds like a no-brainer, but in the school environment, for example, when I do community service within clubs, it's very much like you report to the teacher, you report to the adult, and there's that seniority there, but there's a lack of respect. And I think that's something that's very different within Gamechangers. Like Azalea said, Heather and Ayden have a lot of experience in this field, but they're not using that to belittle the youth, but rather like uplift our ideas.
Y'all are going to make me emotional. Thank you.
That concept of listening to what you both need and want is both so simple and foundational and really hard for people to get behind. And I think there are so many reasons for that, including ageism, adultism, whatever you want to call it, this idea of, well, we went to school for this, we're this age, we're doing this professionally. So we're listening, but not fully listening. For context, one of the reasons that I wanted to reach out to you was I saw your social media takeovers, and that is something that I have seen local programs struggle to even do, like even to give youth access to social media, because, I mean, let's call it what it is. Someone doesn't trust youth to handle that responsibly, and that needs to be addressed. How are we going to engage youth if we don't actually trust youth? And so I see that coming through in your work and not just what you're saying. Now, I No, we're here to talk about a lot of things, but I also want to talk about Gamechangers because I think this is such an amazing program, your youth activism program. You know, it's one thing to go out and engage youth, but it's another to actually follow their lead. And it sounds like you're doing that interagency wise and as a program. But can you walk me through Gamechangers and what the work that you all do?
Absolutely. So it's a little bit kind of what I described before. This team of students who apply, get accepted, and then are, again, I would say, given tools and skills, what I call scaffolding, to get to the goals that they're interested in. So that's going to look like heavy education and having, as Ayden mentioned, like really difficult big conversations that I think a lot of the times we don't give students access to in school, which is understandable. Like teachers can't talk about really significant things. I think that sometimes that's a disservice to students and also doesn't give young people enough room to have these conversations and contribute. But then the program also looks like students going out into the community and doing kind of their own work. So that looks like this year doing these beautiful celebrations and community collective moments with the Madison area and celebrating RCC's 50th. But Azalea, Crystal, like what are some of kind of maybe like your favorite parts of the program, of like the youth work that you like a lot? Any parts of Gamechangers that you think are especially stellar? No pressure.
I was just going to say, I think you mentioned earlier, Heather, how there's a lot of emphasis on like team building and trust between people. We like do lots of exercises just so that everyone can get to know each other better. And I think that's really important for things like the social media takeovers, because then Heather and Ayden and everyone else at least like has like a good idea of like things that we'd be posting or ways that we'd be handling like navigating a social media platform. And I think it really empowers us too, because me personally, if I'm ever posting anything on our Instagram page or our Facebook account, I feel so just like happy and listened to. And I think I have an outlet to express like an aspect of like my interest. And I think that's really important. And it's kind of, I don't know, it's really good. I really like that a lot. And I think those exercises really help us just with being closer as a group, and also with just like taking like a chore or something similar, like posting and making it really exciting and like individual to the person.
Amazing.
Yeah, I would say my favorite part of Gamechangers is the diverse group. I think Heather does a really good job of putting together like groups of people that would not usually interact. And it sounds silly, but we all come from different schools, right, in different areas. And a lot of us are completely different in terms of what we like and don't like. And so in my school setting, there are so many types of people that I would just normally not interact with, just because of the way that our classes are built and the way that high schoolers interact with each other. But I think because of Gamechangers, I'm able to meet all sorts of different people and then also take that into my everyday school experience.
That also just makes the projects better, right? It's like when you have so many voices in the room, you just get to take an idea 4 steps further, right? Like that is so important. Even last year, I was helping with a project that was really centering the experiences of trans survivors and creating resources, both for survivors as well as for sexual violence resource centers, which were, hoping to better their practices. And I watched this really beautiful dynamic where cis students were putting in the work to really uplift the trans folk in that space, and to make sure that there was not a burden on the trans folk who were part of that group to do all the work because they're trans and they should know, right? It was such a beautiful distribution and trust building, and it was just, it is overused, but like the allyship and action that was happening in that space was like, I've never seen anything like it. It was so beautiful.
That project was incredible, and will be used for all future RCC onboarding. And I am beaming with pride.
The biggest in-person event in the movement to end sexual violence is happening this year in San Francisco, and we want you to be a part of it. Valor is proud to host the National Sexual Assault Conference, bringing more than 2,000 advocates, preventionists, and activists together in person for the first time since COVID-19. Our theme, Equity in Action, is all about building cross-movement partnerships to end sexual violence and eradicate all forms of oppression. From LGBTQIA justice to immigration, advocacy, reproductive and disability justice, and the largest prevention track in the country, our workshop tracks are addressing the root causes to violence, how systems come into play to create a culture of violence, and how we can come together to advance equity. Registration opens in May. You can find out more about the conference and how you can attend at nationalsexualassaultconference.org. We can't wait to see you there. I mean, I'm hearing so many parallels to what you shared, Crystal and Ayden, and how primary prevention works in general, and where a lot of programs I feel like face challenges. When we talk about prevention work, when we're talking about how all health disparities impact whether or not someone experiences or perpetrates sexual violence, and we talk about the intersections of anti-oppression work, we know that this is not a single issue silo that we're in, and it affects everyone. So our prevention work should be informed by all people that this work affects. And that takes a lot of intentionality and legwork from staff and agencies. And so I want to give a big shout out to you, Heather and Ayden. You know, coming from a previous local program staff, that is a huge lift. And it's an important lift because if you don't do that work, what ends up happening is that the only people who participate in your programs are survivors. And of course, we need to be uplifting survivor voices, absolutely. But it's like you were saying, Crystal, a diverse group of game changers can make what you're doing impactful for everyone. And that's really important. That's how we reach a wide group of people. I just need to say, I'm shouting out, that's a lot of work, and that's scary, and it makes a difference. So thank you, Heather and Ayden, for doing that. That's wild. And that kind of leads me into my next question about Game Changers. Something that really sticks out to me about your program is that you all are not laser focused on sexual violence in a silo. You seem to really understand the intersectionality of anti-oppression work in ways that even adults in the field still struggle to understand. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? For you all in Game Changers, where do issues like climate change, racial justice, and policies and legislative attacks come in when we're talking about sexual violence?
So I think, as I stated before, something that I say to Game Changers, to adults when we're talking about this program, if we are not talking about lots of different issues, like you said, like climate justice, racial justice, justice for trans folks, we're not doing survivor work. We're not talking about sexual assault because we're only talking about a very tiny group of folks who already frequently have access. So we're trying to reach those marginalized communities. As I say with students, I think engaging in this kind of work should not feel like this heavy obligation. It should really feel like a really beautiful sense of responsibility, and knowing that if we are not having these conversations, we will never effectively do anti-sexual assault work or advocacy work. As the brilliant Audre Lorde said, we do not live single issue lives. For us to also engage students, because I think also this generation, once again, is really in tune with the fact that for so long historically in this country, also based on how we were founded, so many folks have been left out of discussions, have been left out of advocacy, have led entire movements and then been silenced and pushed aside by folks who typically have power. So when I like emphasize the importance of intersectionality. I try to like not even let it be a choice. Our work is not effective if it doesn't involve it.
I was just gonna say, I think part of that's really helpful for our program and our work too, is that because we're all so accustomed to sharing things with each other, and we do those trust building exercises where we're all supposed to interact and share our feelings and talk about current things happening in the world, and just kind of like use the program not only as a way to get work done that helps other people, but also as an outlet to just express things that we're feeling. I think it's really helpful because topics that can be really difficult, like Crystal said, or just like conversations that wouldn't usually come up in classes or in different settings, can come up really easily and healthily and like just in a very comfortable way. Because conversations about difficult things like climate change or unfortunate changes in our government and changes in laws that aren't favorable for people, those are things that we can all talk about, I think, really easily with one another. And it's a very safe environment as well. So I think that adds to the topic of survivorship and things that people experience on a daily basis, because everyone really does share everything that they're thinking about and everything that they've learned. And I think that's part of why it's such a successful program.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on what Azalea said and what Ayden said earlier, I think the fact that we're so comfortable and also so diverse, like my experience may be very different from Azalea's experience, even though we're both youth, and our experiences might be very different from another Gamechangers experience. So just having each of our own very diverse and intersectional experiences in the same area or in the same setting is so productive in terms of getting projects done and getting projects to represent our entire community.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I'd add on to it is that when we, as adults, ask students and young people more broadly to not engage in conversations about what's happening in the news, what is we ask them to not to talk about race, we ask them not to talk about sexuality, and so on, we're asking them to not be full participants in their lives, right? These are things that are just constantly surrounding all of us, right? I engage with students both in schools and occasionally getting to, chat with the Gamechangers now, where I hear just such a deep anxiety about the world that we are all navigating in, right? And asking folks not to have those conversations just because it's uncomfortable for us as adults, just because we're not sure if we want to share our, politics or like how that's going to be received by folks, parents or guardians or other adults in the space. It is such a disservice. And I'm so glad that we do, as an agency, encourage these conversations and encourage moments of disagreement, right? And being able to talk about how we get to a perspective, how our lived experiences shape how we are viewing a particular moment or how we're coming to a particular issue. That is vital. Like, that is such important, like, coming into the world, being an adult skills that most adults don't have, right? I'm so amazed by how much nuance can always be held by our young folks.
I think a big part of what everyone's saying is also like believing lived experience and trusting that as a reality, not like maybe as like that is what is happening. So knowing that like let's look at populations of folks who feel more like comfortable reporting. Let's look at how statistics are gathered. And we know that, and again, this is another really difficult part of like communicating with funders, communicating with adults who maybe aren't doing the work in the same way. We have to do it this way. And we have to believe the stories and experience and knowledge that other folks are telling us. And that includes youth. So I also want to name that like, in Gamechangers, lived experience is going to be respected and honored and also weighted with the knowledge that can help us transform and grow. Also, for any listeners, if you hear me horribly snapping, that's something I do in Gamechangers just to communicate to students, to guest speakers, like I hear you, I really appreciate what you're saying. It's just another way that I like to affirm folks when we're together. So for any listeners that are like, what is that noise? That's what it is.
to. And I will keep the snapping. I'm not editing the snapping out because I love the snapping.
And you absolutely can take out the snapping.
No, it is affirming. It's affirming for me too. I'm like, yes, okay, I'm on track. I'm like, Heather's telling me I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine. I'm going to keep going. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Prevent Connect is taking this conversation even further on our social media, and we want you to be a part of the discussion. Join in on the conversation on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we're posting excerpts from this podcast and so many more, and asking experts, practitioners, and followers like you to share your stories and ideas. Search Prevent Connect on your social media platforms to get involved. You mentioned, I think it was Ayden, that RCC really commits itself to uplifting and upholding and respecting youth voices. And that's such an important piece. And sometimes it's one of the pieces that gets left out, one of the few pieces that gets left out. Oftentimes, I find that prevention departments are like super on it with this stuff. They're like, I understand anti-oppression work. I understand what it means to do community organizing, to engage youth, to engage communities. And then no one else in the agency does. So then you have like this little pocket of people who are doing the work, but they're not necessarily being supported, and there's a disconnect. And just because a prevention coordinator is affirming, if the CEO or the executive director is not affirming, then the agency cannot be affirming. So I'm curious, how does RCC lean into that intentionality of supporting the work that you all do as an agency?
Yeah, I think that limitation is present because so few people had adults really listen and respect them when they were young people, right? Like that imagination it's not even something that can come into people's imagination because they never had that experience. I know the moments that stick out for me most in my life are adults who heard what I said and were like, this is it, we're going to run with it, right? So I think that I think that Heather and I try to follow that, right? And people who work with the Gamechangers and folks who believe in the work that young people do for us and how they can inform what we do, we try to like bring that into every conversation. Like I would be the first person to name that Heather like can come into a meeting and tell you exactly every single amazing thing that a young person said, did, or informed us and how we were going to implement it. Like I have never seen another person do, right? So it's not just showing up and saying, we're going to listen, we're going to take your lead when we're in the room with young people, but transferring that, like coming into a meeting and being like, this is what I learned, this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to engage in this hard conversation. I'm going to push back. I'm going to fight for this thing that the young people who aren't in the room have named that they need. And I really appreciate the way that Heather always centers that in every conversation I've ever had with her.
I really appreciate that. That's like my biggest goal in this work. So hearing that from a colleague that I like deeply respect and admire their work, literally one of the most organized people I've ever met in my entire life, will take over the world at some point. I cannot wait to see the Ayden presidency. A phrase that I have with students is sometimes it's not as PG, but I'll say I will flip tables for you. I got this phrase from a brilliant Black woman named Nastic Morris, who works at the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault, when she was talking about allyship. And I think something that she imparted on me and all her brilliance was we need to re-earn our ally card every day. That means being vocal. That means being deliberate and unafraid in certain moments. It also means as adults, I also have to emphasize this when talking about adults, we are the adults here. We are the ones that should be taking responsibility to advocate for students and what they're telling us. When it comes to students, I sometimes, like, as Ayden said, I have really strong boundaries, like they will be listened to. And I do also think that is because that our agency, while it's flawed and has its own history of stuff, as every agency does, prevention, since I've stepped into this role, has been really emphasized. And this is really difficult, but a huge part of that is funding. I think a lot of the time adults are afraid that we won't be able to find funding, that it won't be consistent, that we won't be able to keep this beautiful program. And it took a lot of legwork, and it continues to take a lot of legwork to kind of piece together funding for our program. I think I would say the last thing, I think I have in my 6 years, we have the best leader that we've ever had. Her name is Dana, and she is a powerful Black woman who understands the intricacies of intersectionality and is absolutely also willing to go to bat for students. I look to her as an example of how to do student advocacy and how to really be unwavering in support for students and following their lead. So I also want to recognize it's with good leadership. Has it always been good leadership? Who knows? But at least now I also feel really empowered because of who is the face and power behind our agency.
We can say that, like, we messed up as a movement, and especially as a professionalized movement. We can say that we've been problematic as individuals, as agencies, as a movement, whether that was our intense reliance on the criminalization of sexual violence, which we know targets Black and brown people, whether it was our over-reliance on funding that we're now tied to. Like, there are places where we went wrong, and that doesn't make us bad. It just means that we have to make adjustments and keep showing up and earn that ally card. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So, how do we grow from here? That's
exactly.
When I ask, how do we grow from here? And also, if we're not modeling that behavior of like taking accountability, we're not doing youth work super well. Because we're trying to be the example for these students. So.
Our goal at Prevent Connect is to make sure you have the tools you need to successfully prevent violence and advance health equity. Whether you're brand new to the field, onboarding new staff, or just looking to strengthen what you already know. That's why we're releasing downloadable resource guides available for free at preventconnect.org. Our guides directly connect you with learning tools, all the way from foundational skill builders to advanced theory and research. We're collecting the best e-learnings, web conferences, blog articles, podcasts, journals, and more, and compiling them into topic-specific guides, so you have options no matter how you learn or what level you're at. Access our guides by clicking on the Resources tab on our website, preventconnect.org. Well, speaking of doing our youth work better and making a change, we're going to transition for these last few minutes of our podcast. I would love to ask for some advice from you all, and especially Azalea and Crystal, and then Ayden and Heather, if you want to pop in about, how you could support that as adult staff working this movement. As I mentioned before, youth engagement has been our highest requested topic from people who do prevention all across the country. They really want to do it. They either don't know how, never have, or are experiencing some kinds of challenges doing that work. So I'm going to pretend that I am a new person to this work, or maybe I'm someone who's struggling to engage youth, and I would love to ask for your perspectives. I want to get my program started. Maybe I've had a couple of events and I've invited youth. No one has shown up. And I'm really just feeling like people don't want to come. Like, the youth in my community are not interested in my program. So I'm not really sure what the point is. What advice would you give me to do this work in an impactful way?
Crystal, I don't know what you're thinking, but I was kind of thinking, there's this girl at my school, and she's in my grade, and she started a club at our school, an activism club, where we were supposed to watch movies every week, and then we were supposed to debunk the problematic things about these like popular movies and discuss like ways that we could change them, ways that they were harmful to people. And it was just kind of a way that this girl wanted to like, I guess kind of debunk standards in society and how they're harmful to people. And no one really went. I only knew about it because she was like in my class. So she started making like a social media account, and she did posts that were kind of similar to the ones that we do, where they're just posts about like a variation of topics. And sometimes they're sexual awareness posts, sometimes they're about, like the fluidity of intersectionality and expression of identity and things like that. And some of her posts are just like self-appreciation posts and reminders to like take a minute for yourself and to like breathe throughout the day. And I think that's a really helpful way, especially today with how many like social medias that we have. I think that's a really good way for someone, especially if they don't want to put themselves fully out there, to kind of just interact or experience kind of just like people's perspectives and their thoughts, and to communicate with people without having to put too many resources, like whether they be financial or just like emotional or time-wise, into something if people aren't like fully showing up for it. I don't know. Crystal, what do you think?
I mean, I totally agree with everything you were saying, but my brain to like schools, right? Like,
oh, that too.
We are students and we're in schools so many hours every day. So, and that's actually how I found out about Gamechangers in the RCC. Bree, I think, came into my health class and spoke about it. And I think that for adults, there is a disconnect between youth and adults in the community because the only place we really interact are in schools. So I feel like utilizing that and, coming into schools and speaking about ideas that you're passionate about, and also just being genuine. I think students can tell when an adult is very passionate and genuine versus when they simply just need to get ahead in their work, if that makes sense. So just really going into spaces that are youth-led, or not even youth-led, but youth-occupied.
That kind of makes me think of Ashley Hartman, too, who was someone that we worked with, I think, a couple years ago for one of our projects. Because like Crystal said, one of Heather and Ayden's coworkers, Bree, came into my school in my health class too. And she like recruited me for the program when I was in 8th grade. She like gave me the information so I could apply. And I kind of agree with what Crystal was saying about how it's like so important in schools to communicate that as well. But yeah, this woman, Ashley Hartman, she does this incredible artwork, and she has like an email list that you can subscribe to, and she sends you this activism-centered artwork like to your inbox like every single week. And I think that's another example, like Crystal was saying, about people just being, you can tell when someone's genuine and when they're like putting effort into doing something to connect with people and to do work in activism. And I think that's just like a really good example of that too.
I also think what they both captured beautifully is meeting students where they are. So utilizing social media as a way to reach our youth, because we know that they're engaging that way, and it presents really unique opportunities that I think sometimes adults don't know totally how to strategize around. I also really like what they both said about schools. I think engaging with folks in schools is good because, again, they're already there. Meeting folks where they are, not always expecting folks to come to you, kind of reaching out and showing, kind of vetting yourself a little bit. And I think that will also help bring folks closer to you. One thing I will always say is students and young folks are often asked to do free labor. We're not doing that. That's one of my pet peeves with other adults. So I would say also put money on the table, find funders who are willing to do this work. I always say, like, at a national level, at a county level, at a city level, and even neighborhoods, grants exist for so many different areas, and being able to pay and compensate students for their expertise is really important. So I would also give that as like a top of the list that also really addresses some things that are really important about accessibility. We also pay students for like their transportation, because we know some students are coming, like 35 miles to our meetings. So making it accessible, and also like putting your money where your mouth is.
Yeah. I think so often where people come into this problem is they're imagining what may have gotten their attention when they were 16, but that was a long time ago, right? Like understanding that what you like is not necessarily going to translate now. And that doesn't make you a bad person. That doesn't make you a bad youth organizer. It just means that you are in a different place in your life, and that's okay. I think one of the things that folks sometimes forget that they can do is ask the young person in your life, right? It's like, what would grab your attention right now? Maybe you don't have like, obviously, like a group of 20 young people that you're trying to recruit, but maybe you have a cousin or a nephew, or maybe like at your place of worship, there's like a youth group that you want to like chat with, or wherever, right? Like start small, have those conversations, and like come into it with humility. Like young people will tell you what you're doing wrong, right? And like you just have to listen to that and say thank you and then implement that, right? If folks see you just being like, fantastic feedback, love this, and then you do the opposite, that is going to stick in people's brains, right? And that creates a snowball effect, I think, very often, where folks just, you know, hear that things are not going so good and don't want to engage even further.
Thank you. Thank you all for that. So I'm hearing a few things. I'm hearing get creative, try new things. It's okay to start small. Just like our organizations didn't pop up overnight, neither will a youth engagement program, and learn to celebrate when you can. Like know what to celebrate, and like don't forget to celebrate the small things. I'm hearing meet youth where they're at. And I have to say, I really appreciate you talking about schools, because Gamechangers is, I think, what the quote unquote field, which is like people who work professionally to prevent violence, would call a community-based program. And I oftentimes see people being like community versus school. So if we're going to do community stuff, we're not doing schools anymore. And that's not the case. And schools do still really have a very important piece in this work. So thank you for that. And be honest, be real, be genuine, be willing to admit when you're wrong, and compensate youth just like you would compensate anyone else. That's all really powerful advice that, yeah, I hope that listeners take in. And I'm seeing similar themes with all of the people that I'm talking to for this podcast series, which tells me I'm talking to the right people. And I just really appreciate you all. I wish we could talk for hours, but I know we're coming up on the end of our conversation. If people are listening to this and they're like, wow, these people are rad, I need to learn more, this wasn't enough for me, how can they get connected to you all and learn more about Gamechangers, RCC, your school programming, all the things?
I think going to our website is a great first step, and that's the rcc.org. And there you can find links to like Gamechanger stuff and where we're at in our application process. I also think you already plugged it for us so nicely. The Instagram account is something great, RCC Gamechangers, that folks can follow. What about you guys? What are other good ways we can reach other folks?
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, I agree that Instagram is a great place to start.
I think I'd be remiss if we missed the opportunity to say, you know, if you are invested in this work and you are hearing that funders are sometimes a barrier in this, the unrestricted funds from people donating is huge and allows us to do this work without having to report, without having to send our money, or rather spend time, you know, getting back to our grant funders who we love desperately. But you can go to the rcc.org/donate and support this work. It goes so far. You know, we make $1 stretch in every single piece of our work, from our, you know, survivor services to the Gamechangers and everything in between. And we are always eternally grateful.
No, and it's a great point too, right? Because we rely on our grant funding to pay for our staff time and a lot of the stuff we do. But an example, grant funding isn't going to buy the pizza because a lot of grants don't allow you to purchase food. So if we're going to do these things, like meet people where they're at, also, we can't invoice youth. Like that's something I always find with grant dollars is like, yes, we can pay youth, but we need an invoice from a 14-year-old. And I'm like,
What?
No.
Just give them cash, or they'll write a check. And I'm like, they don't have a bank account. I don't understand. Like, give them a gift card. So it's unrestricted dollars is always a welcome gift. Well, honestly, Ayden, Crystal, Azalea, Heather, thank you so much for sharing this time with me and your expertise. I will keep following you on Instagram because it's one of my favorite Instagrams. And I do a lot on social media through Prevent Connect. So I'm giving you like a triple thumbs up, and I think people can learn a lot from you. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yes, for recognizing the expertise of youth. And most of all, thank you to my queens who came on this call. Appreciate you so much. You're so smart. I've already given them all the pep talks.
Prevent Connect is brought to you by Valor US and the Centers for Disease Control, and made possible by listeners like you. You can find more information about this episode, along with past episodes, web conferences, and blog articles at preventconnect.org. As we work to bring you more podcasts like this one, we want to hear from you. You can interact with us and suggest new topics on our Instagram in the comment section of this episode post. And if you liked this episode, make sure to like and rate this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so we can reach more listeners like you.